Hey everybody, it's Alex again, and today I wanted to make a video on rimshots on your snare drum. It's just a way you play when you're hitting the snare drum. Your stick is essentially hitting the center of the head and the rim of the snare drum at the same time, so it provides a little extra kind of snap and crack to it. And as you just saw in that video, I kind of went between the two different techniques, and they do have a little bit of a sound difference that isn't kind of that big if you just listen to it kind of quickly, but once you get more into the mixing process, it can really kind of shape how your finalized recording sounds. So if we look at this intro clip again, you can kind of see on the waveform here that the waveforms for the rim shots are a little bit louder than just the standard ones here. So I kind of alternate between rim shots and then just normal strikes and then rim shots again, and then it looks like normal. So on this, if I play it again, you can just kind of see, for reference, how these sound volume-wise. So there's a bit of a difference there, especially just in the overall volume. But where you can really kind of tell this is when you isolate the individual snare recording. So if I solo just the snare drum here, and for here I'm just hitting the snare drum, so it's not the full kit. Again, you can really see the difference in volume on the different hits between the rim shots and just hitting it normally in the center without hitting the rim at the same time. Now where this becomes important in the mixing stage is when you start adding compression. And a big thing, this is more so kind of suited to rock, metal, punk drums. So you wouldn't, necessarily maybe process things this heavily on, like jazz or R&B or something like that, possibly. But with the snare drum, if I open up this channel, you can see I've got a little bit of EQing going on. Now the compressor, if you've seen the previous video that I made on snare drum compression, the compressor not only has the benefit of evening out each hit between strike to strike, but it's also shaping the attack characteristic. And if we set the compressor the same on here, you can kind of hear that when the rim shots are going along, it's compressing the signal a lot harder because it's a louder signal going into the compressor. Versus a normal shot, it's not going to compress it quite as much. So when you add more compression like that, you're kind of enhancing the attack of that, especially if you've got the attack dialed in correctly, where it's letting the initial transient through, but it's kind of clamping down on the sustain of it. So with the compressor here, keep an eye on the gain reduction and then the just overall signal level in relation to this. So on the rim shots, it's doing a decent amount of gain reduction on here. And then on the normal shots, it's not doing quite as much. So the reason why this is important is because with the louder shots on there, you get a little more increased attack from that once you add on the compressor. And now you could say, well, yeah, well, why don't you just adjust the compressor threshold so that on the normal hits, it's compressing it just as hard as the rim shots. And while you could do that, the danger in doing that, not danger, but the added side effect is that if you're doing something with ghost notes, where you're playing not as loud, but you're doing like kind of quieter or ghost strokes in between the main hits, it's going to sound a little bit like this. Let's turn off the compressor. So you can hear in between the main hits, I'm doing a little bit of just softer hits in between. And again, on the waveforms between this, you can see on the rim shots, the range of volume is a lot greater, especially if I zoom in, than the little ghost notes that I'm playing in here. So by compressing this, it's taking this down a little bit, and it's giving me more of a dynamic range or a volume range between the loud hits and the ghost note hits. So if I go to the normal hits on here, you can see there's only a little bit of a difference between the two. So if you overcompress these, they can just sound like you're doing a little snare roll because there's not as big of a volume difference and it's harder to distinguish. So between here, this is again without compression, you can hear what it sounds like with the normal hits. Versus the Rimshots coming up here. With the Rimshots, you can really clearly distinguish the main hits versus the ghost notes that you're playing in between. So having the compressor on there helps out as well, because once you're adding the attack from the compressor on these Rimshots, you're still maintaining that not as much dynamic range since you're compressing it a little bit, but it's still enough to make a clear distinction between the regular notes, or the Rimshots, and the ghost notes. Versus with that same compressor on here, the normal notes there's still not quite as much of a range between the two strikes on there. So that can really come in handy on the ghost notes there. And lastly, where this also comes important is on your overheads. So your overhead microphones are going to pick up the kit as a whole. It's basically going to capture everything in the drum set. It's not an individual isolated source like you have a mic right up on the snare drum. So if I slow the overheads here and zoom in a little bit, you can pretty much see where the snare hits are just on the waveform itself. And then they're pretty clear to look on here. Let me see. Versus when I'm doing the normal hits, they're still noticeable, but it's not as big of a peak on here. So with this, if I click the overheads, turn off the compression, I've just got a little bit of lows rolled off here. The snare drum really pokes through the cymbals when you're hitting it. And now you can hear the snares, it's still being heard, but it's not as distinguishable in the context of the hi-hats, or especially crash cymbals and things like that. So not only does that help your snare stick through a little bit more in the overheads and not get lost in the cymbal bleed, but again, that is also going to play into effect when you have a compressor on here, because in doing that, it's compressing that louder snare more quickly in order to be able to shape the transient attack. So you get a little more snap out of that. By playing a Rimshot, you automatically get more of that attack, but with the added benefit of having a compressor with the attack set to a good time, it's going to give you a lot more snap out of that while still being able to hear the snare pretty clearly above the cymbals. So here's what it sounds like with the compressor. Now back to the normal hits here. So again, you can still hear the snare drum, but it's a little more kind of forward and in your face when you're playing with the Rimshots, especially when you add in the compression on there. And while that may not seem like a huge thing, just in the context, of a mix, it does add up, especially if you're doing a lot of processing and you're really trying to get that kind of rock sound where the snare drum is just, really in your face and punching through the mix pretty consistently. That's one of the biggest things that I've kind of learned that really can help that finalized sound getting through to the end of the mix. It's just playing with Rimshots gives you not only more dynamic control between the quieter notes and your loud, backbeat notes, but it's also going to come into effect and make the mixing process a little bit easier, because you've got a little more kind of range to work with, and you can really shape that attack a bit more than you would be able to if you were just playing on the center of the head versus hitting the rim at the same time. So thanks for watching. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Please subscribe if you want to see more of these, and I'd be curious to hear what you guys want to see more of as well. I'd be happy to make a few more videos on stuff like this. But again, thanks for tuning in, and I hope to see you next time. Thanks.